The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her helmet one final time. The dusty streets of Fallujah stretched ahead, a maze of concrete buildings and narrow alleyways that had become synonymous with danger. As a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division, she had seen her share of hostile territory, but something about this particular mission felt different. Her squad of 12 soldiers was tasked with delivering medical supplies to a forward operating base on the outskirts of the city. Intel suggested the route was relatively secure, but in Fallujah, security was always relative. The insurgents had been unusually quiet for the past week, which made everyone nervous. Quiet often meant they were planning something big. Maria checked her medical kit for the 100th time that morning. Morphine, bandages, tourniquets, and all the tools that might mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. At 28, she was one of the most experienced medics in her unit, having served 2 previous tours in Afghanistan. Her steady hands and calm demeanor under fire had earned her the respect of every soldier she had treated. The convoy began moving at 800 hours, 3 heavily armored Humvees cutting through the morning heat. Maria rode in the second vehicle, constantly scanning the rooftops and windows for any sign of movement. The local population seemed to have vanished from the streets, another red flag that made her grip her rifle tighter. Sergeant First Class Thompson, the squad leader, crackled over the radio from the lead vehicle. His voice carried the weight of responsibility for 12 lives under his command. They were making good time, approaching the halfway point of their journey when the world exploded around them. The first improvised explosive device detonated beneath the lead Humvee with a thunderous roar that shook the earth. The massive blast sent the armored vehicle spinning through the air before it crashed upside down in a cloud of smoke and debris. Maria's training kicked in immediately as she shouted orders to her driver to stop and take cover. Before anyone could react, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. The insurgents had planned this ambush perfectly, positioning themselves in buildings on both sides of the narrow street. Bullets ricocheted off the armor plating as Maria's team scrambled for defensive positions. The third Humvee in their convoy tried to reverse course, but struck another hidden explosive device. The blast was even more devastating than the first, and Maria watched in horror as flames engulfed the rear vehicle. She could hear the screams of wounded soldiers over the chaos of gunfire and explosions. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed her medical kit and prepared to leave the relative safety of her vehicle. Her duty was clear. Wounded soldiers needed immediate medical attention, and she was their only hope. The driver tried to stop her, knowing that stepping into the killing zone meant almost certain death. But Maria had taken an oath to save lives, and she would not abandon her brothers in arms. She kicked open the heavy door and sprinted toward the overturned lead vehicle, where she could see movement inside. Bullets whined past her head as she dove behind a concrete barrier, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The ambush had been perfectly executed. The insurgents had waited until the convoy was trapped in the narrow street with no escape route before springing their trap. Now 12 American soldiers were pinned down with wounded men who would die without immediate medical attention. Maria took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and prepared to risk everything to save her fellow soldiers. She had no way of knowing that within minutes her body would be riddled with bullets, beginning an incredible story of survival that would test the limits of human endurance and the bonds of military brotherhood. Maria sprinted across the open ground toward the overturned Humvee, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each desperate step. The insurgents had turned the narrow street into a deadly corridor, with muzzle flashes erupting from windows and rooftops on both sides. She could hear Sergeant Thompson's weak voice calling for help from inside the twisted wreckage. The first bullet struck her in the left shoulder, spinning her around, but not stopping her forward momentum. The impact felt like being hit with a baseball bat, but her adrenaline masked most of the pain. She stumbled but kept running, knowing that stopping meant death for both her and the trapped soldiers. 2 more rounds hit her in rapid succession, one tearing through her right thigh, another catching her in the side just below her body armor. Blood began seeping through her uniform, but Maria's training kept her focused on the mission. She had treated countless wounded soldiers, and she knew she could function despite her injuries if she stayed calm. She reached the overturned vehicle and immediately began assessing the casualties inside. Thompson was conscious but had a severe head wound that was bleeding profusely. Private Johnson, the youngest member of their squad at just 19 years old, was trapped beneath twisted metal with what appeared to be a broken leg and internal injuries. Working quickly, Maria applied pressure bandages to Thompson's head wound while simultaneously checking Johnson's pulse. His breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of shock and possible internal bleeding. She needed to get both men stabilized and evacuated immediately, but the intense gunfire made any movement extremely dangerous. The insurgents seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were concentrating their fire on anyone who tried to help the wounded. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions, indicating this was a well-coordinated attack involving multiple enemy fighters. Her remaining squad members had taken defensive positions behind concrete barriers and the damaged vehicles, returning fire when they could identify targets. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, fighting for their lives while trying to protect their wounded comrades. Another bullet found its mark, striking Maria in the back and exiting through her chest, narrowly missing her heart. The impact drove her to her knees, and for a moment her vision went dark. Blood filled her mouth as she struggled to breathe, but somehow she found the strength to continue treating her patients. Johnson was fading fast, his skin growing pale and clammy as shock set in. Maria administered morphine for his pain and started an IV line to combat the blood loss, all while bullets continued to impact the overturned vehicle around them. Sparks flew as rounds struck metal, and she could smell the acrid smoke from burning oil and rubber. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The remaining soldiers were running low on ammunition, and Maria was losing blood rapidly from multiple gunshot wounds. She had been hit 7 times now, but somehow remained conscious and functional, driven by pure determination to save her fellow soldiers. Radio calls for reinforcements crackled through the static, but help seemed impossibly far away. The nearest American forces were at least 30 minutes out, and Maria wasn't sure any of them would survive that long. The insurgents showed no signs of retreating, continuing to pour devastating fire into their position. As she worked to stabilize Thompson's head wound, another round struck her in the arm, shattering bone and sending a shock of agony through her entire body. Still, she refused to give up. These men were depending on her, and she would not let them down regardless of the cost to herself. The sound of gunfire intensified as the insurgents pressed their attack, sensing victory was within their grasp. Maria knew they were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, but she also knew that giving up was not an option. Her training, her oath, and her love for her fellow soldiers would carry her through this hell. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was only 37 minutes. Maria had now been struck by 14 bullets, yet somehow continued to function through sheer force of will. Her uniform was soaked crimson, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing minute. But the wounded soldiers needed her expertise to survive. Private Johnson's condition had deteriorated rapidly. His blood pressure was dropping dangerously low, and Maria suspected severe internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. With trembling hands, she administered another dose of morphine and adjusted his IV drip, knowing these measures could only buy him precious time. Sergeant Thompson remained conscious despite his head trauma, though he was becoming increasingly disoriented. Maria had managed to stop the external bleeding, but head injuries were unpredictable. She needed to monitor him constantly for signs of brain swelling or other complications that could prove fatal. The insurgents had adopted new tactics, using rocket-propelled grenades to try to finish off the survivors. One RPG struck the concrete barrier where 3 of Maria's squadmates had taken cover, sending chunks of debris flying through the air. The explosion temporarily deafened everyone and filled the air with choking dust. When the dust settled, Maria could see that Corporal Williams had been struck by shrapnel in multiple places. Despite her own critical injuries, she crawled toward him, dragging her medical kit behind her. Each movement sent waves of agony through her body, but she pushed forward, driven by an unbreakable commitment to her fellow soldiers. Williams was conscious but in severe pain, with deep lacerations across his back and legs. Maria began cleaning and bandaging his wounds while bullets continued to snap overhead. Her hands shook from blood loss and exhaustion, but years of training guided her movements automatically. More rounds found their mark on Maria's already battered body. Bullets 17 and 18 struck her in rapid succession, one hitting her left leg and another grazing her neck. The neck wound was particularly concerning as it came dangerously close to major blood vessels that would have caused instant death. The remaining soldiers fought desperately to hold their position, but ammunition was running critically low. Staff Sergeant Davis, the senior non-commissioned officer after Thompson's injury, made the difficult decision to conserve their remaining rounds for a final defensive stand. They were trapped with no escape route and wounded comrades who could not be moved. Maria's medical supplies were also nearly exhausted. She had used most of her morphine, all of her pressure bandages, and both IV bags trying to keep her patients stable. Blood loss from her own wounds was making her increasingly weak and dizzy, but she refused to stop working. The insurgents seemed determined to finish off the American patrol completely, maintaining intense pressure despite taking casualties from return fire. Their voices could be heard calling to each other in Arabic, coordinating their positions for what appeared to be a final assault. As bullets 19 and 20 struck her torso, Maria finally collapsed beside the overturned Humvee. Her vision was starting to blur, and she could feel consciousness slipping away. But even as her strength failed, her medical training continued to guide her actions. She used her last remaining bandage to apply pressure to Johnson's most serious wound. The sound of gunfire reached a crescendo as the insurgents prepared for their final push. Maria's squadmates readied themselves for the last stand, knowing they were outnumbered and almost out of ammunition. The wounded soldiers lay helpless, depending entirely on their comrades' ability to hold the line. In those dark moments, as Maria fought to remain conscious despite massive blood loss, none of them could imagine that help was already on the way. Elite forces had received their distress call and were moving toward their position with the speed and precision that had made them legendary among American military units. But first, Maria would have to survive 4 more bullets in the next crucial hours when death seemed more likely than rescue. The insurgents launched their final assault just as Maria lost consciousness for the first time. Bullets 21 through 24 struck her motionless body within seconds of each other, but miraculously missed vital organs and major arteries. Her fellow soldiers watched in horror, certain their medic was dead. Yet somehow she continued breathing despite the devastating wounds. Staff Sergeant Davis took command of the desperate situation with only 4 combat-effective soldiers remaining. They had exactly 37 rounds of ammunition left between them, facing an enemy force that seemed to have unlimited resources. The mathematical reality was stark. They could not win this fight through conventional means. The wounded lay scattered around the kill zone in various stages of medical crisis. Johnson was unconscious and barely breathing, his pulse growing weaker by the minute. Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently due to his head trauma. Williams fought to stay awake despite severe blood loss from his shrapnel wounds. Davis made a decision that went against every military protocol, but was their only hope for survival. He ordered his remaining soldiers to cease fire completely and take the lowest possible defensive positions. The plan was to make the insurgents believe they had won, drawing them into the open where the Americans could use their last ammunition most effectively. The tactic worked initially. Insurgent fighters began advancing cautiously from their concealed positions, weapons raised but moving with less caution than before. Davis waited until he could see the whites of their eyes before giving the signal to open fire with everything they had left. The surprise counterattack caught the insurgents off guard, dropping 3 of them immediately and forcing the others to scramble for cover. But the Americans had used most of their remaining ammunition in that brief engagement, leaving them with only a handful of rounds for any further fighting. Maria's body lay crumpled behind the overturned Humvee, her blood mixing with the desert sand. To her squadmates, she appeared dead or very close to it. 24 bullet holes in her uniform told a story of incredible courage and sacrifice, but also seemed to mark the end of her remarkable medical career. Unknown to the embattled soldiers, her vital signs remained surprisingly stable despite the massive trauma. Her body had gone into a kind of protective shock, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve her brain and heart. Years of physical conditioning and mental toughness had prepared her for this ultimate test of survival. The insurgents regrouped quickly after their initial surprise, realizing the Americans were nearly defenseless. They began a methodical advance, firing controlled bursts to conserve their own ammunition while closing distance for the final assault. Victory seemed assured as they moved from building to building, tightening the noose around the trapped patrol. Davis gathered his remaining men for what would likely be their last stand. Each soldier had exactly 2 rounds left, hardly enough to make a difference against a determined enemy force. They prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible, protecting their wounded comrades until the very end. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder as insurgents moved through the rubble-strewn street. Davis could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their positions for the final push that would eliminate the American patrol completely. He gripped his rifle tighter, knowing these would be his last moments alive. Johnson's breathing became increasingly labored as his condition continued to deteriorate without medical intervention. Thompson had fallen unconscious again, his head wound still seeping blood despite Maria's earlier treatment. Williams tried to crawl toward a defensive position, but was too weak from blood loss to be effective in combat. The insurgents were now less than 50 meters away, close enough that Davis could see their faces clearly. Some appeared to be experienced fighters, while others looked like local civilians who had joined the attack. All were armed and determined to finish what they had started. In the distance, barely audible over the sounds of urban combat, rotors began beating the air. But Davis and his men were too focused on the immediate threat to notice the faint noise that would change everything. They prepared for what seemed like certain death, unaware that the most elite fighting force in the American military was racing toward their position. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors grew stronger, but Davis and his surviving soldiers were too focused on the advancing insurgents to recognize what it meant. With less than 30 meters between them and certain death, they prepared to make their final stand with whatever strength remained. Suddenly, the insurgents stopped their advance and began looking nervously at the sky. The rotor noise was becoming unmistakable now, multiple aircraft approaching at high speed. Some of the enemy fighters started backing toward their escape routes, sensing that the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. The first helicopter appeared over the rooftops like an avenging angel, its sleek profile immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with special operations aircraft. Davis felt his heart leap as he realized what was happening. Navy SEALs were inbound for a rescue operation. Within seconds, the second helicopter swept over the combat zone, and elite operators began fast roping down into carefully chosen positions around the ambush site. These were not ordinary soldiers, but members of SEAL Team 6, the most highly trained and experienced special operations unit in the American military. The insurgents found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire as the SEALs engaged multiple targets simultaneously with precision rifle fire. Years of intensive training and combat experience showed in every movement as they systematically eliminated threats while avoiding casualties among the wounded Americans. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison led the rescue team with the calm professionalism that had made him legendary among special operations forces. His team had been monitoring radio traffic when Davis's distress call came through, and they had immediately diverted from their original mission to attempt this high-risk rescue. The SEALs moved through the combat zone like ghosts, appearing and disappearing behind cover while maintaining devastating, accurate fire on insurgent positions. Their advanced equipment and superior training gave them an overwhelming advantage, but they knew time was critical for the wounded soldiers. Morrison reached Maria's position first, quickly checking her vital signs while his teammates continued engaging enemy targets. Despite 24 bullet wounds and massive blood loss, she was still alive, a testament to her incredible physical conditioning and mental toughness. Her pulse was weak but steady, and she was still breathing on her own. The SEAL medic immediately began emergency treatment, starting IV fluids and administering drugs to combat shock while bullets still flew overhead. These operators were trained to provide advanced medical care under the most extreme conditions, and Maria's injuries, while severe, were not beyond their capabilities. Johnson was in critical condition, requiring immediate evacuation to survive. The SEALs worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize him for transport, while their teammates systematically eliminated the remaining insurgent threats. Thompson and Williams were conscious but would also need urgent medical attention. The insurgents, realizing they were now facing elite American forces, began a fighting withdrawal toward predetermined escape routes. But the SEALs had anticipated this tactic, positioning teams to cut off the most likely avenues of retreat. Several enemy fighters were eliminated as they attempted to flee. Morrison coordinated the medical evacuation, while maintaining tactical control of the battlefield. His team had turned a certain massacre into a successful rescue mission through superior training, equipment, and execution. But the hardest part was still ahead, getting the critically wounded soldiers to medical facilities in time to save their lives. Within 15 minutes of their arrival, the SEALs had secured the area and prepared all casualties for immediate evacuation. Maria remained unconscious but stable, her body fighting desperately to survive despite the incredible trauma she had endured. The other wounded soldiers were conscious and responsive, their conditions serious but manageable. As the medical evacuation helicopters arrived, Morrison took a moment to survey the battlefield. The courage displayed by Maria and her squad had been extraordinary, even by special operations standards. They had fought against overwhelming odds and refused to abandon their wounded comrades, embodying the finest traditions of the American military. The rescue was complete, but Maria's fight for survival was just beginning. 24 bullet wounds would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation, assuming she survived the next critical hours. The medical evacuation helicopter raced through the Iraqi sky toward the combat support hospital in Baghdad, with Maria fighting for her life on the stretcher. The SEAL medic worked continuously during the flight, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting medications to keep her stable. Her blood pressure remained dangerously low despite multiple IV lines pumping fluids and blood products into her system. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting in the trauma bay when the helicopter touched down. As the chief surgeon at the combat hospital, she had treated thousands of wounded soldiers, but Maria's case was unlike anything she had encountered. 24 bullet wounds across her torso, arms, and legs had somehow missed every major organ and artery, a medical miracle that defied explanation. The surgical team worked for 14 hours straight, removing bullet fragments, repairing damaged tissue, and stopping internal bleeding. Each wound required meticulous attention to prevent infection and restore function to damaged muscles and nerves. The surgeons marveled at Maria's incredible luck. Just millimeters in any direction and several of the bullets would have been instantly fatal. Maria remained unconscious for 3 days following surgery, her body fighting to recover from the massive trauma and blood loss. Her family flew in from Texas, maintaining a constant vigil beside her hospital bed. Her mother, Rosa Rodriguez, had been a nurse for 30 years and understood the gravity of her daughter's injuries better than most. When Maria finally opened her eyes, the first person she saw was Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the SEAL team leader who had led her rescue. He had returned to check on all the wounded soldiers, but Maria's recovery held special significance for him. Her courage under fire had impressed even the hardened special operations veteran. The road to physical recovery would be long and challenging. Maria faced months of painful rehabilitation to regain full use of her arms and legs. Several bullets had damaged nerve pathways, requiring specialized therapy to restore normal function. The psychological trauma of the ambush would also need attention, as many combat veterans struggled with post-traumatic stress. Johnson made a full recovery after emergency surgery to repair internal injuries caused by the vehicle rollover. Thompson required additional treatment for his head trauma, but eventually returned to active duty with no lasting effects. Williams recovered completely from his shrapnel wounds and later received a Bronze Star for his actions during the ambush. 6 months after the ambush, Maria stood before a formation of soldiers at Fort Bragg to receive the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat. Despite using a walking cane due to lingering nerve damage in her leg, she stood straight and proud as the medal was pinned to her uniform. The citation read in part, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez displayed extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty while serving as a combat medic during an enemy ambush in Fallujah, Iraq. Despite being wounded 24 times by enemy fire, she continued to provide life-saving medical treatment to her fellow soldiers, demonstrating courage and dedication that reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Army." Maria's story became legendary within military medical circles, inspiring a new generation of combat medics to maintain the highest standards of courage and professionalism. She returned to active duty after 18 months of rehabilitation, though she was assigned to training duties rather than combat operations. The SEALs who rescued her remained in contact, forming bonds that extended far beyond that desperate day in Fallujah. Morrison later said that Maria's actions under fire represented everything admirable about American military personnel, the willingness to sacrifice everything for fellow soldiers. Years later, Maria would establish a foundation to support wounded veterans and their families, using her own experience to help others navigate the challenging path of recovery. She never considered herself a hero, always insisting that she had simply done her job as a medic. The narrow street in Fallujah where the ambush occurred was later named Rodriguez Way by the Army unit that eventually secured the area. A small plaque commemorated the courage of the soldiers who fought there, though Maria always said the real heroes were the men she had treated that day. Her survival against impossible odds remained a source of wonder for medical professionals and military personnel alike. 24 bullets that should have been fatal had instead become a testament to human resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between soldiers who served together in combat.